New York had two kings. They didn't share territory. They didn't share allies. They didn't share air. For 15 years, their war stayed cold. Not the kind of war that makes the evening news. Not the kind that leaves bodies in the streets or sirens screaming through the night. Their war was quieter than that. It lived in paperwork that disappeared before signatures could dry, in cargo ships delayed just long enough to cost millions, in investment deals that collapsed without explanation, in trusted associates who suddenly changed sides. No public bloodshed, no headlines, just silent sabotage, disappearing shipments, frozen accounts, ruined reputations. Two empires tightening their grip on opposite sides of the same city, pretending the other did not exist. And one rule: family stays out of it. Wives were protected. Children were shielded. Bloodlines were not to be weaponized. For 15 years, that rule held, until the children came home. Within the same week, without knowing about each other, the heir of one empire and the daughter of the other landed in the United States. He stepped off the plane carrying expectation. He had been groomed for leadership, raised to inherit power, trained to believe the city would one day answer to his name. He came to prove he was ready. She arrived with something different: awareness. Her father did not shield her from the truth of his world. He prepared her for it. Before she left, he told her, "It's time you learn how power really works." Neither of them knew the balance between their fathers was fragile. Neither of them knew pride is more volatile than violence. And neither of them knew the first person who would change their life was the one person they were never supposed to meet. Their paths crossed in a place meant for luxury, not conflict. A room full of crystal glasses and polished marble, a moment that should have been forgettable. And when they did meet, there were no sparks, no destiny, no music swelling in the background. It wasn't love at first sight. It was humiliation. And in a city ruled by men who never forget the slight, humiliation can be more dangerous than a gun. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. And subscribe for more stories. It happened at Le Céleste, a place where reservations weren't requested. They were approved. A place suspended high above Manhattan, wrapped in glass and golden light, overlooking a skyline that felt less like a city and more like a kingdom waiting to be ruled. It was the most expensive reservation in the state. Politicians dined there quietly. Investors made quiet deals. Power shifted hands between courses. Mistakes were never made there, not publicly. Adrian Moretti arrived 10 minutes early, not because he needed to, but because arriving late suggested insecurity. His father had taught him that timing was part of dominance. He moved through the restaurant like someone who belonged there, nodding slightly to the maître d', acknowledging recognition without encouraging familiarity. He was entertaining two potential partners that evening: a tech acquisitions firm interested in expanding logistics networks along the Eastern Corridor. Strategic, profitable, necessary. Adrian wore confidence like it had been tailored alongside his suit. Calm smile, relaxed shoulders. The kind of presence that implied he had already calculated the outcome of every conversation before it began. Then he saw her. Elena sat alone at a window table overlooking the river. No elaborate dress, no attention-seeking posture, just a clean black silhouette against the city lights. She had a single glass of sparkling water in front of her and a small leather notebook resting near her hand. No jewelry. No phone on the table. No visible attempt to be seen. She wasn't performing for the room. She was observing it. And that was what caught his attention. And in places like Le Céleste, everyone performs. Wealth is theater. Status is costume. Conversations are rehearsed. She wasn't acting. She was studying. Adrian found himself glancing at her more than once as his guests arrived. The meeting began smoothly. Market projections, acquisition forecasts, polite laughter at strategic jokes. He was articulate, sharp, practiced. But he was aware of her, aware that she hadn't once looked impressed by anyone entering the room. When his partner stepped away briefly to take a call, Adrian made a decision. He approached her table. "May I?" he asked, but he was already pulling out the chair across from her. She looked up slowly, not startled, not flattered, just mildly inconvenienced. "You already decided," she replied. Her voice was calm, not sharp, not warm, simply factual. Adrian smiled as he sat. I believe in initiative." "I believe in consent," she said lightly, turning her glass between her fingers. The comment landed cleanly. His associates, now returning, paused just long enough to catch the tone before resuming their seats. They chuckled politely, assuming flirtation. Adrian misread the moment. He interpreted composure as challenge, and challenge, in his world, meant engagement. He shifted seamlessly back into conversation, discussing infrastructure expansion, private aviation partnerships, overseas portfolios. His voice carried the subtle rhythm of someone accustomed to being heard. Elena listened, not interrupting, not nodding, not reacting. When he finished a particularly polished explanation about building legacy beyond the present generation, she finally spoke. "Is that who you are?" she asked evenly. "Or just what you inherited?" The words were not loud, but they cut. The table went still. The investors looked between them, unsure whether to laugh. Adrian leaned back slightly. "You're bold," he said. She tilted her head. "You're loud." It wasn't an insult. It was an observation. But observation can wound more precisely than accusation. Adrian felt heat rise behind his calm exterior. He reached for the wine list without breaking eye contact and signaled the sommelier. He ordered a rare vintage, a bottle expensive enough to imply authority, the kind people purchase not for taste, but for optics. The sommelier nodded with careful respect. Adrian leaned forward slightly. "You should be careful speaking to men like me." There it was, not a threat, a reminder. Elena's expression didn't shift. "Why?" she asked. "Nah, because men like me are accustomed to being respected." She stood, not abruptly, deliberately. The chair moved back with a soft whisper against the marble floor. She reached into her bag and removed her card, placed it calmly on the table. "Men like you," she said, looking directly at him, "mistake volume for value." The investors stiffened. Adrian felt the air shift. Before he could respond, she continued. "You speak about legacy like it's character. It isn't. It's inheritance. And inheritance doesn't make you powerful. It just makes you positioned." The sommelier returned with the bottle at that exact moment. Elena turned slightly toward him. "I'll cover their table," she said. The sommelier hesitated. Adrian opened his mouth to object, but something in her tone, quiet, controlled, made it impossible. She signed the receipt without looking at the amount. Then she looked back at Adrian one final time, not angry, not impressed, simply finished. "Good luck proving you're more than a surname," she said softly, and she walked away. No dramatic exit, no glance over her shoulder, just the steady stride of someone who did not need the room to validate her. Adrian remained seated. For a few seconds, he didn't speak. He had never been dismissed publicly. Not once. People negotiated with him, flattered him, deferred to him. But she had not deferred. She had assessed and rejected. His investors attempted to recover the mood with awkward humor, but Adrian barely heard them. His focus remained on the door she had exited through. It wasn't attraction he felt first. It wasn't anger either. It was something unfamiliar. Displacement. Well, for the first time in his life, someone had looked at him and seen not influence, but emptiness. and that realization echoed louder than any insult could have. When the check arrived, he stared at the signature at the bottom. Elena. No last name. No title. Just a name. Adrian Moretti had never been dismissed. Not once. And that night, he was. And in a city built on pride, humiliation is rarely the end of a story. It's the beginning of one. Dominic heard about it the next morning. Not from Adrian, from the restaurant owner. The call came just after 7, before the city had fully shaken off the night. Dominic was already awake, seated at the long oak table in his private study, reading financial summaries that required no visible reaction. He listened without interrupting as the owner described the scene with careful neutrality. No damage done, the man assured him. No scene. But it was noticed. Dominic thanked him, hung up, and stared at nothing for a long moment. It wasn't the embarrassment that concerned him. It was instability. Adrian was summoned within the hour. The office Dominic used for private conversations was not large. It didn't need to be. Power did not require space. It required control. The room held floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, with a single heavy desk and 2 leather chairs placed with intentional symmetry. Adrian entered dressed impeccably, as always. He closed the door behind him and waited. Dominic did not look up immediately. He finished signing a document before setting his pen down. "Sit," he said calmly. No raised voice, no threats, just quiet disappointment. Adrian took the chair opposite him. Dominic folded his hands. "I received a call this morning." Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. "I assumed you might." Dominic studied his son's face. "Did she insult you?" "Yes." "Did she lie?" The question lingered in the air. Adrian looked away briefly. That was answer enough. Dominic leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. "You want to inherit what I built?" he asked evenly. Adrian met his eyes. "Why? Then learn this now. A man who cannot control his ego in public cannot control power in private." There was no anger in his voice. That made it worse. Adrian felt the weight of the words settle heavily in his chest. He had expected reprimand, perhaps even frustration. Instead, he received assessment. Dominic stood and walked toward the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Do you know how many men have tried to provoke me over the years?" he continued. "How many insults I have ignored?" Adrian said nothing. "Respect," Dominic said quietly, "is not demanded. It is observed." He turned back toward his son. "You were observed last night." Adrian felt heat rise, but it wasn't defensive. It was shame. "She challenged me," Adrian said carefully. Dominic nodded slightly. "Good." The response startled him. "Good," Adrian repeated. "Yes," Dominic replied, "because challenges reveal cracks." He returned to his seat. "What did she say?" Adrian hesitated. "She implied I haven't earned what I speak about." Dominic's expression did not change. "And have you?" The question was not accusatory, was surgical. Adrian opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. Dominic saw it. "You see," he said softly, "you mistook confrontation for disrespect, but perhaps it was clarity." Adrian exhaled slowly. "She dismissed me. Publicly. And that wounded you." "Yes." Dominic leaned forward slightly. "That is precisely the problem." Silence stretched between them. Dominic's voice lowered. "If your sense of authority can be shaken by a stranger at dinner, what happens when someone tries to take territory from you? Or loyalty? Or leverage?" Adrian swallowed. "This world does not forgive insecurity," Dominic said. "It devours it." The words were not dramatic. They were factual. Adrian had grown up watching his father navigate threats without visible reaction. He had mistaken that calm for indifference. Now, He understood it was discipline. "Find her," Dominic said. Adrian blinked. "What?" "Find her," he repeated, "and apologize." The instruction felt almost surreal. "You don't even know what she said." "I don't need to," Dominic replied evenly. "If you were secure, it wouldn't have mattered." The truth of that stung. Adrian stood slowly. "You think I embarrassed you?" Dominic shook his head once. "No," he said quietly. "You embarrassed yourself." That landed harder than any anger could have. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Dominic's gaze softened, not visibly, but subtly. "When I was your age," he added, "I mistook dominance for strength, too." Adrian looked up. Dominic rarely referenced his past. "It cost me," Dominic continued. "More than pride." There was something in his tone Adrian had never heard before. Regret. Not about business, about something else, something unspoken. "Power," Dominic said after a pause, "is restraint, not reaction." Adrian nodded slowly. He understood the lesson intellectually, but emotionally he was still unsettled. "Why apologize?" he asked quietly. Dominic considered that. "Because if she was wrong, it costs you nothing," he said. "And if she was right, it costs you everything not to." Adrian absorbed that. The room felt smaller now. He realized something uncomfortable. His father was not protecting reputation. He was protecting him. "Find her," Dominic repeated. Not to win, not to impress. To listen." Adrian turned toward the door. He paused before opening it. "Would you have apologized?" he asked without looking back. Dominic did not answer immediately. "Yes," he said finally. "Eventually." Adrian nodded once and left. Walking down the hallway, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't humiliation. It was reflection. For the first time in years, he wasn't defending himself. He was questioning himself. And beneath the embarrassment, beneath the sting of dismissal, beneath the bruised pride, there was something else. Curiosity. Not about her status, not about her wealth, about her clarity. And that unsettled him more than anything she had said. Because if she had seen something in him that he hadn't, then maybe she hadn't insulted him at all. Maybe she had revealed him, and that was far more dangerous. They met again 3 days later. Not planned, not arranged, not orchestrated by fate or manipulation. Just coincidence, or something close enough to feel like it. It was a bookstore cafe in Brooklyn, the kind of place that smelled like paper and roasted coffee beans, where conversations were softer and people came to disappear for a few hours. The walls were lined with uneven wooden shelves, and handwritten staff recommendations were taped beneath dog-eared novels. Elena sat near the back, a book open in front of her, a ceramic mug cooling beside her elbow. She wasn't reading as much as she was thinking. The city felt different now. Smaller. As if the dinner at Le Celeste had shifted something invisible. She sensed him before she saw him. Not because he made noise. He didn't. But because certain presences carry weight. She glanced up. Adrian stood near the counter, having just noticed her. For a split second, they held eye contact across the narrow room. He hesitated. That was new. 3 days ago, he would have crossed the distance without pause. This time, he moved slower. Measured. He approached the table, but he didn't touch the chair. "No chair pulling," she said without looking away from him. "No assumptions," he replied evenly. He remained standing. That, too, was new. Silence lingered between them. Not awkward, just cautious. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "For what?" "For trying to impress you instead of listening." She studied his face carefully, searching for sarcasm or strategy. She found neither. That surprised her. She had expected defensiveness. pride. A clever counter-argument disguised as charm, not introspection. Most men, she said, closing her book. Double down. I know, he replied quietly. I almost did. She gestured toward the empty chair. You can sit. He did. There were no investors this time, no polished performance, just two strangers sharing a small wooden table beneath warm cafe lights. What changed? She asked. My father, Adrian admitted. She arched an eyebrow. That's not what I expected you to say. He told me something, Adrian continued, that if my ego can be shaken in public, I'm not ready for private power. She leaned back slightly. And you believe him? Yes. That answer came quickly. And what do you believe? She pressed. Adrian paused. I believe I've been rehearsing my entire life, he said slowly. For something I've never questioned. Her expression softened, just slightly. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the faint hum of espresso machines and the rustle of turning pages. What were you reading? He asked. She glanced at the book. A study on leadership psychology, she replied. Why people follow certain personalities and reject others. And insecurity is louder than confidence, he exhaled quietly. I suppose I proved that. Perhaps, she said. But insecurity isn't weakness. Pretending it isn't there is. The conversation shifted naturally after that. They talked, not about money, not about influence, but about expectation, about being raised with invisible scripts already written. Adrian admitted he had never applied for a job, never worried about tuition, never questioned whether the city would open doors for him. It's assumed, he said, that I will step into something already built. And do you want to? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. I don't know what wanting feels like, he admitted. I know what obligation feels like. That honesty landed deeper than either expected. Elena wrapped her hands around her mug. When I was 12, she said quietly, my father gave me a ledger instead of a birthday gift. Adrian blinked. What was in it? Names, she replied. Debts, enemies, assets. He said, memorize this. It's your inheritance. Adrian felt something tighten in his chest. That's not a childhood, he said softly. It was protection, she corrected automatically, then paused. Or at least, that's what he believed. Do you? She looked toward the window. I think he wanted me strong. He just didn't know another way. Adrian nodded slowly. Sorry, my father gave me cufflinks when I graduated, he said. He said, you'll wear these when you step into power. And do they matter? She asked. No, he said honestly. They just remind me that something is waiting. For the first time, she smiled. Not amused, not impressed, just genuine. Not because he was powerful, not because he carried a legacy, but because he was honest. And honesty is rare in rooms built on strategy. You don't sound like someone who wants to rule, she observed. Maybe I don't, he replied. Then why not walk away? He gave a short, humorless laugh. Because walking away would hurt people who built everything believing I wouldn't. She understood that, more than she wanted to admit. Do you ever feel, he asked carefully, like your life was decided before you were born? She met his gaze. Why, yes. That single word carried more weight than any argument. They were not flirting. Not really. They were recognizing. Two heirs raised differently, but shaped by the same invisible cage. Outside, the late afternoon light shifted toward evening. The cafe grew quieter. Neither of them noticed the time passing. For the first time in days, Adrian didn't feel defensive. For the first time in years, Elena didn't feel evaluated. They weren't discussing empires. They were discussing escape, not from each other, but from expectation. And somewhere between confession and quiet laughter, something fragile formed. Not romance, not yet. Understanding. And sometimes that is more dangerous, because attraction can fade. But recognition changes everything. The war had rules, unwritten but understood. No public escalations, no targeting family, no reckless retaliation. For 15 years, Dominic Moretti and Viktor Kovač had followed those boundaries with disciplined restraint. They destabilized each other's business quietly. They undermined contracts, redirected alliances, and outmaneuvered influence. But they never crossed certain lines. Because some lines, once crossed, cannot be redrawn. But wars do not survive on principle alone. They attract opportunists. And Dominic's consigliere, Matthew Rinaldi, understood that better than anyone. Matthew had served Dominic for nearly 2 decades. Calm, intelligent, indispensable. He was the architect behind several of Dominic's most strategic expansions. He negotiated deals no one else could close. He anticipated threats before they fully formed. And he had grown wealthy during tension. Conflict created complexity. Complexity required mediation. Mediation required Matthew. Peace, on the other hand, simplified everything. And simple systems do not need middlemen. It was a private investigator Matthew hired, under the guise of routine due diligence, who uncovered the connection first. The woman from Le Celeste, Elena Kovač. At first, Matthew stared at the file in quiet disbelief. The coincidence was too sharp. The daughter of Viktor Kovač meeting Adrian Moretti in public. Twice. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. If Dominic learned this immediately, he would tighten control. He would contain it. Possibly even negotiate a quiet disengagement. The tension would stabilize, and stability did not serve Matthew. So he did not go to Dominic. Instead, he prepared something else. He requested security footage from Le Celeste under the pretense of reviewing potential vulnerabilities. He edited the footage carefully. He removed the portions where Adrian looked uncertain. He cut out Elena's calm detachment. He framed angles where Adrian leaned in. He slowed certain movements to suggest intimacy. He muted the audio, left only visuals. Cut to look like seduction. Cut to look intentional. A strategic approach. An infiltration. Then he sent it anonymously to Viktor Kovač. No name attached. No explanation. Just a message. Look closely. Across the city, Viktor sat alone in his private office when the encrypted file arrived. He did not expect anything unusual. He played the video once, then again. His jaw tightened slowly. He saw his daughter seated across from the Moretti heir. He saw Adrian lean forward. He saw what looked like familiarity. He did not hear context. He did not see hesitation. He saw proximity. And proximity, in a war like this, is rarely accidental. They send their son now? Viktor muttered under his breath. The memory surfaced instantly. 15 years ago, a failed truce, a dead brother. Dominic claiming it was collateral damage. Viktor never believed that. And now this? His daughter? Was this retaliation wrapped in charm, or infiltration disguised as coincidence? He replayed the footage again. This time, he didn't see romance. He saw strategy. He saw Dominic reaching into his house without stepping inside. Viktor stood abruptly and walked toward the window overlooking the city. For 15 years, he had obeyed the rule. Family stays out of it. Had Dominic broken it first? Or was this something else? Across the city, Dominic received his own warning. It did not come from Matthew. It came from an independent contact in the private security network, someone who owed Dominic a favor. Your son has been seen meeting Viktor Kovač's daughter, the voice said over a secure line. Dominic did not react immediately. Confirm, he replied. It's confirmed. The call ended. The room went cold. Not because of Adrian, but because of timing. Dominic knew his son well enough to recognize naivety before malice. But history? History does not forgive coincidence. Dominic leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes briefly. 15 years of calculated restraint, balanced on a fragile understanding. If Viktor believed this was intentional, he would interpret it as provocation. And provocation would require response. Dominic did not feel anger first. He felt disappointment, not in Adrian, in himself. Had he underestimated how quickly the past could resurface? Had he failed to teach his son how dangerous proximity could be? His phone vibrated again. Another message, this time from Matthew. "Sir, we may have a situation." Dominic stared at the screen. Matthew's timing was almost too precise. He typed back only 2 words. "Explain." Matthew entered the office 15 minutes later, with controlled concern etched across his face. "I believe Kovač has discovered the connection," Matthew said carefully. "There are unusual movements among his security team." Dominic studied him. "How did he discover it?" Matthew lowered his eyes slightly. "It's possible someone leaked footage." Dominic's expression did not shift, but internally, he felt the structure of 15 years begin to tremble. "This is not coincidence," Matthew added quietly. That sentence did what the footage had done to Viktor. It reactivated history. Dominic stood slowly. "Call a security review," he ordered. "Increase surveillance on Adrian." Matthew nodded. As he turned to leave, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, not visible to Dominic, but present, because tension was returning, and tension was profitable. Meanwhile, 2 young heirs sat unaware that their private conversation in a bookstore cafe had already been weaponized. They believed they were choosing something new. They did not realize they were standing at the center of something very old. And somewhere between pride and paranoia, the rule had already cracked. Family stays out of it. For 15 years, that line held. Now it blurred. And when history and inheritance collide, the damage rarely stays contained. Viktor did not summon Elena immediately. He waited. That was his way. He did not explode, he calculated. But calculation does not quiet fear. It sharpens it. By the time he called her into his office, the sun had already set. The room was dim except for the city lights bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. Elena recognized the setting. This was not a casual conversation. This was an evaluation. She stepped inside without hesitation. "You wanted to see me." Viktor did not gesture for her to sit. Instead, he tapped a remote on his desk. The screen behind him flickered to life. Security footage. Le Celeste. Muted. Edited. Adrian leaning forward. Elena listening. A freeze frame on what looked like intimacy. Her pulse shifted, but her face did not. "Did you know who he was?" Viktor asked. "No." His eyes narrowed. "Are you lying?" "No." Silence thickened the room. Viktor stood slowly. His voice did not rise, but something in it fractured. "They will use you." It wasn't accusation. It was fear. Elena felt it immediately. "I am not a tool," she said quietly. "You are my daughter," he snapped. The words came out sharper than he intended. She held his gaze. "That's the problem." The statement landed harder than any denial. Viktor stared at her, as if seeing her not as a strategist, not as a successor, but as something fragile. "You think I built all of this," he said, gesturing vaguely to the city beyond the glass. "So you could gamble with it?" "You built all of this because you didn't know how to live without fighting," she replied. His jaw tightened. "You think this is about romance?" he demanded. "No," she said steadily. I think this is about history you never finished." The words cut clean. Viktor turned away from her, facing the skyline. For 15 years he had maintained the rule. Family stays out of it. And now his daughter was standing in the middle of the one place he had vowed she would never be. "You don't understand what men like him are taught," Viktor said, voice lower now. "They are raised to inherit. They are trained to calculate." "So was I," Elena replied softly. That stopped him. Because she was right. He had prepared her for this world. He just never imagined she would choose to enter it on her own terms. Across the city, Dominic confronted Adrian in a room far quieter, but no less charged. "You started something you don't understand," Dominic said calmly. Adrian did not sit. "I didn't start it." Dominic's expression remained composed. "You met with the daughter of the only man in this city who would interpret that as provocation. I didn't know who she was. That no longer matters." Adrian's hands curled slightly at his sides. "You think this is about strategy," Adrian said. "It wasn't." Dominic's eyes sharpened. "Intent does not erase consequence." Adrian stepped closer. "You're afraid." Dominic did not react to the accusation. "Of what?" he asked. "That I might choose something you didn't." Silence followed, the kind that carries history. "I didn't start this," Adrian continued, voice quieter now. "You did. Years ago." That silence cut deeper than shouting. Dominic felt it. The unspoken truth hovering between them. The failed truce. The escalation. The blood that followed. History had never been fully explained to Adrian. It had simply been inherited. Dominic exhaled slowly. "This is not about ego," he said. "No," Adrian replied. "It's about pride." Dominic did not deny it. Within 24 hours, security tightened across both empires. Phones were taken, drivers reassigned, schedules cleared, private security details doubled, meetings went. Elena found her access restricted, subtly but unmistakably. Adrian noticed his movements monitored with sudden precision. They were not imprisoned, but they were contained, separated, not by hate, by legacy. Viktor sat alone later that night, staring at the city lights. He told himself he was protecting her. Dominic poured a glass of whiskey he did not drink, replaying his son's words in his mind. "You did. Years ago. 2 fathers. 2 empires. Both claiming protection. Both acting from fear. And somewhere in the space between protection and control, 2 heirs realized something painful. They were not being punished. They were being preserved. Like assets. Like leverage. Like future kings and queens who had never been asked if they wanted the crown. And for the first time, the war was no longer between Dominic and Viktor. It was between past and future. Between inheritance and choice. Between fear and love that had barely begun. They managed one last meeting. An underground parking garage beneath a shuttered financial tower in Lower Manhattan. Concrete pillars, flickering fluorescent lights. The distant hum of traffic above them. The air smells like oil and rain. No guards, no weapons, no entourages, just urgency. Elena arrives first, her footsteps echoing lightly against the concrete. Adrian appears moments later from the opposite ramp. For a second, they simply look at each other. Not as heirs, not as liabilities, but as 2 people who finally understand the weight pressing down on them. "We can leave," Adrian says, his voice low but steady. "Tonight. I have access to cash, clean passports. We disappear. Different countries, different names." She studies him. He means it. "And let them burn the city because we disappeared?" Elena replies. "Well, let them turn this into proof that the other side made us run." He steps closer. "Then we stay," he says. "We inherit it. We step into it. And we try to change it from the inside." A faint, humorless smile touches her lips. You really think power changes people for the better? She asks. No, he answers. I think people change power, if they're strong enough. She searches his face for doubt. There is some, but there is also resolve. If we stay, she says quietly, we become them. Footsteps echo faintly at the far end of the garage. Time is ending. He reaches for her hand. She lets him take it. Their fingers lock, not out of desperation, but decision. Both knowing that whatever choice they make will cost something permanent. Their freedom, their innocence, or each other. The sound of approaching voices grows louder. When love is born between enemies, does it escape the war? Do you run away, or do you sacrifice everything to stop it? What would you choose? Would you run and protect your love, or stay and risk becoming the very thing you hate? Tell me in the comments, should they escape or fight from within? And if you're ready for part 2, make sure you're subscribed, because the next decision changes everything.